Kia ora, talofa, namaste, haere mai, and welcome to this week's episode of The Niche Cast, another bumper Aotearoa sporting podcast from a couple of lads at The Niche Cache. The niche-cache.com is where we have some hearty and hefty Aotearoa sporting content for you to digest. I just delivered a White Ferns T20 International Series debrief from their series against Bangladesh. Wildcard has a National League Men's Grand Final review, as well as a National League Women's Week 12 review. Flying Kiwis Wildcard just seems a bit on pause at the moment with all the stuff happening with the World Cup and Kiwis not necessarily dominating the, I was going to say airwaves. I think there's a better term, maybe vibrational footballing waves around the world. So we'll just chill out on the Flying Kiwis, but there is National League content. Any football content you're thinking of whipping up in the coming days for the website?
Well, there might be a Flying Kiwis this week if I can finish it in time. Because an Elite played this morning, which built it up a bit more. And there's been a couple good games in Scotland, and there's some sort of dudes not playing, but still doing interesting things. Like Ollie White signed a contract extension. Chris Wood's currently in a curious situation where he's offered at like a training camp in Saudi Arabia, appeasing the owners and taking use of that Saudi hospitality. Hot weather training. Should get a Phoenix thing out before the men come back to play on Saturday. Saturday evening double banger. Might talk about that later on. The men and the women both playing on the same day. And there's a couple other ideas that probably won't get done this week because I also want to do a Breakers thing on Friday because that's been pushed back far too long. And also we got an album jukebox that's got to be finished. That's I'm holding up currently by needing to listen to a couple more things a second time to get my ideas. But there's plenty on the books.
So for cricket, you can read about the Blackcaps, you can read about the White Ferns, you can read about Ford Trophy as well. Football, there's a lot of National League content there. Basketball, plenty of Stephen Adams, incoming Breakers yarns, and rugby league. This is the season for a lot of junior Kiwi NRL information. We got the Siwa Wong crazy year. That yarn is up. We've got the Kiwi NRL train and trial breakdown. We've got the Kiwi NRL juniors who helped Australian teams make finals in 2022. And just published, I did the Francis Manuleleua and the Kiwi NRL Panthers yarn wildcard. And this is just something I want to get off my chest to some extent, or just spew up some information here as the warm-up korero. Warm-up korero is usually like you're out there, you're having a stretch. You know, if I'm that dude, team environment, probably asking a few questions. You know, what did you have for dinner last night? What do you like about this? What do you like about that? How's the weather? Those are the usual warm-up korero. This one, I'm just spinning the yarn wildcard. I just had a fantastic story to tell from the other day. The boys and even the girls, the training stuff, maybe we're playing a mixed game at touch, who knows? But we got the audiences here. We're swinging a leg, we're having a stretch, we're throwing the ball around. Warm-up korero, fresh off this Francis Manuleleua, joining the Penrith Panthers and the Kiwi NRL Panthers breakdown. A couple of bits of information I just found fascinating. So, with all due respect to the rugby landscape around Aotearoa and the rugby landscape around the world, even the rugby league landscape around Aotearoa and the rugby league landscape around the world, most notably Australia, I think Auckland is the hub of junior rugby league and rugby union in the world. You've got a bunch of big first 15 schools. You've got two different first 15 competitions that are both pretty good, 1A, 1B. And most, of course, we're dealing in Kiwi NRL expansion. Everything's growing and expanding around Aotearoa. But you also have the highest concentration of league players who go on to play NRL in Aotearoa. So that combination of league and union comes together for Auckland being a junior footy hub of the world. Francis Manuleleua, in this league and union hub of the world, he was playing first 15 in year 10, which means in his second year of high school, he was playing first 15. That means he had 4 years of first 15 rugby at one of the biggest first 15 schools in Aotearoa. That's pretty epic in itself. Francis Manuleleua is joining the Panthers, and he does so as a league junior who then went to play first 15 rugby. So if you're a Panthers fan, you don't have to worry about him transitioning from first 15 to league and how that might go. Francis Manuleleua has a prodigious history in rugby league. One example of that is when he was playing the under-15 final for Papatoetoe Panthers against Marist Saints. This is on YouTube. This is in the yarn on our website as well. Marist had Dean Mariner playing 6. He is now playing for the Broncos. So you had Manuleleua number 6 for Papatoetoe, and you had Dean Mariner number 6 for Marist. Marist also had Sebastian Jack, Stanley Iongi. Papatoetoe Panthers had your boy Navajo Doyle, Dragons up-and-coming star. Ben Penny, who was in the Warriors SG ball team. And Ali Leatawa. He was captain. He was starting at centre, and he is training with the Warriors NRL squad. Ali Leatawa was 2 years ahead of Francis Manuleleua at school. So in that under-15 final, Leatawa's whatever age he might be, who knows, but he's the captain of the team, and Francis Manuleleua is the starting number 6, and he is 2 years younger than Leatawa. Of course, you know, if you're born in February, it mixes up the eligibility and all that. It's just part of a package that I find interesting, because when Francis Manuleleua was playing for the future Warriors under-16 team, Brian Smith, you know, one of the historic rugby league coaches, long-time figure in Australian rugby league, he said Francis Manuleleua was one of, if not the best player on the park as a 14-year-old. So here we go. We're stacking on top of each other. We're compounding funky notes about Manuleleua. He was also one of the very few players to play 2 years of under-16 New Zealand Residents Rugby League, which doesn't usually happen because obviously the best players, they probably leave Aotearoa or they just move up to the next age bracket. As we've established, Manuleleua was playing up an age group a lot, and he played 2 years. He was selected for the New Zealand Rugby League under-16 residents team 2 years in a row. Now he leaves school and he goes straight into the Jersey Flegg squad of the Penrith Panthers. Usually in Queensland, someone leaves school, they go play Malmaninga Cup, which is under 18s. In New South Wales, they play SG Ball, which is under 19s. All of the Warriors players who played first 15 rugby and are now selected in the SG Ball squad, they finish school, they're into the SG Ball squad. Francis Manuleleua leaves school and he is selected in the Panthers Jersey Flegg squad, which is under 21s. It's like, I think that lays out this kid's level of talent and what he has been able to do in Aotearoa, if the best footy nation in the world, let alone specifically in Auckland. Highly competitive first 15 and league systems. So this dude is pretty good at footy. Let's just say that. Anything to bounce off that wild card?
Well, something you said at the start about Auckland being a hub of both junior league and union, I thought was pretty interesting, because you were saying that and I was thinking, like, where else in the world is that the case? Like, there's obviously a lot of, like, plenty of great cities or areas that develop players in either and sometimes both, but not often to the like high level balance of each of them. Because you think, like, in England, just as generically speaking, but like unions often played in the more southern counties and league in the more northern counties. Like there's a long history of why that is the case. In Australia, there are plenty of decent union schools, but league dominates. Like that gets the run of the mill. I guess you could argue that union dominates in Auckland and across Aotearoa, but in particular, I think, I don't know, the balance seems different in Auckland because you've got the grassroots thing going on, and it's the only place in the country where there is, the Blues are there, of course. There's also the Warriors, though. Like there's a professional team in both of those sports. Like that's most countries are good at one or the other, and like maybe if they're good at both, one still dominates the other. It seems interesting that I can't really think of anywhere else in the world where it would be the case where it's like the scales are balanced,
It's because there's not. Like, I don't say these things lightly. Like, I ponder these things a lot. Meditation, out on the walk, in nature, and I'm whipping up these ideas that I believe are true. And Francis Manuleleua was an absolute beast in one of the most productive footy areas in the world. So ponder that yourselves. And also, just one other thing I want to throw up here, Wildcard. I do want to lay this out over the summer. We've talked a little bit about, well, I've suggested that the Bulldogs, for a variety of reasons, are an interesting marker for the New Zealand Warriors for the next season. Perhaps a rivalry. I want to throw the Broncos in that mix as well. So I think if you're a New Zealand Warriors fan, you're looking at the Bulldogs, you're looking at the Broncos, and those are the teams to measure the New Zealand Warriors against. Not only as far as like, love to beat those teams in a game of footy, right? That would be fun. But also like just the wider context, how they perform over the season, and what happens. Because I think they are Bulldogs and Warriors, they're kind of looking to reinvigorate themselves, really. And the Broncos are an interesting one that I want to add to this equation because there's a bit of crossover. The Broncos are another team, one of these historic Australian teams that think that like because they were once good, they should always be good, that type of thing. They encountered some difficulties last year. You had the players leaving the Broncos to join the Warriors because they were based in Redcliffe, which is in Brisbane. And you've also got this Reece Walsh situation, which I think is the crux of this comparison. Because you swapped Reece Walsh and Te Maire Martin. I don't think Te Maire Martin's going to play fullback for the Warriors, but you basically swap those players, and I think they are a very interesting marker to compare the Warriors against. And I'd like to put some gasoline on this fire, Wildcard, by saying, I just want to get this exact. I should have had this up in a tab before I started recording, but I do want to get this exact. I think it's 4 of the top 6 players for the most errors in the 2022 NRL season will all be with the Broncos next season. Yep, 4 of the top 6. Reece Walsh, Selwyn Cobbo, Corey Oates, and Katoni Staggs in the top 6 for most errors last season. I've brought that up before, and I think it's an interesting thing to ponder with the Warriors versus Broncos comparison. So if you are a Warriors fan, tune in closely to what the Bulldogs are doing, and especially what the Broncos are doing, because you might find joy, you could find disappointment. Like, we know Warriors fans love to disappoint themselves and love to be disappointed. So you could be disappointed because the Bulldogs or Broncos are better. I think there's also a chance the Broncos don't have the same crossover as the Bulldogs. You got Andrew Webster, you got Cameron Ciraldo, both from the Panthers coaching tree and so on. But the Broncos, in theory, they should be much better than the Warriors. And I think people think they will be much better than the Warriors. Not convinced. And I just want to throw that out into the atmosphere for folks to ponder ahead of the Warriors season, and especially as we get into like spinning yarns with your homies over the Christmas, New Year's break. Like, these are just seeds you can drop. These are little bits of information that you can chew your mate's ear off about the Warriors and lay out some context. Anything on that little comparison, Walker?
Well, only that my favorite thing about the Warriors Bulldogs rivalry is that thing that you mentioned about how they each signed a Panthers assistant coach. One who's, I can't remember which the balance is. One is the more like attacking minded one, and one's the more defensive minded one. And one went to the Bulldogs, one went to the Warriors. Like the two teams that were both looking for a new head coach in particular. The teams are obviously looking for coaches, I'm assuming. I don't think they were the only two, but the two sort of like most desperate teams, I guess you could probably argue. Where do you go? Just look to the best team and grab their assistance. It's that will in itself, like aside from all the other things that you laid out, with Warriors versus Bulldogs and Warriors versus Broncos as well. Like aside from everything else, just that alone is a funky one to see how that goes. Because I don't know. This sounds counterintuitive when talking about I almost said the mighty Vodafone Warriors, the mighty 1NZ Warriors, or however you're supposed to say it. But I kind of think they're better set up for a head coach to come in and be more immediately successful than the Bulldogs are. I kind of think that's the case.
But the Bulldogs have Cameron Ciraldo.
Like he's the attacking 1A.
I think he was the defensive Panthers
okay, other way
coach.
Around.
Andrew Webb's the mastermind behind the revolutionary Panthers attack. Never heard that said, but Cameron Ciraldo, he's the defensive guru and the best coach entering a head coaching job, obviously. Big up to the Patreon whānau. That Patreon podcast we did earlier this week was an absolute banger, comparing the Blackcaps to English cricket, learning about both nations, and especially with the context of the Blackcaps touring Pakistan in a couple of weeks, and then England coming to Aotearoa later in the summer. That is there for the Patreon whānau. Best way to support the Niche Case is via Patreon, patreon.com/elnichecase, elnichecase. Thank you to all the members of the Patreon whānau who support us and all our content. We greatly appreciate it. There's that extra podcast every week. And if you are enjoying the podcast, the yarns on our website, and the email newsletters twice a week, it's just $1 a month. That's all you need to do for the Patreon whānau, and it's there for you to spread some generosity and support the mahi. Shout out to all the Ride or Die Patrons as well. Been there for a long time. We appreciate you. Email newsletter comes out via Substack every Monday and Friday evening, thenichecase.substack.com, and that's where you get all the extra Kiwi content, Kiwi sports content. Little notes, little anecdotes, little nuggets, little gems, ponderings. It's all there, and it's probably well worth the subscription and the read, whether you do it on a Monday evening after work or whether you do it on a Saturday morning with that sent out on a Friday evening. However you want to do it, it's going to be there in your email inbox, so you might as well check it out. All the links to our website and the latest yarns are available there, as well as all the links to our podcasts as well. thenichecase.substack.com. Obviously, we're from the Niche Case, theniche-case.com. Meaty old intro that. Didn't forget about what mindfulness, mate. So what do you got?
Didn't forget about it. I almost forgot about it myself before when I was scrambling to get ready, and then oh wait, I got to whip something up. So I thought, let's be topical. It's the first day in ages where there wasn't a football World Cup game on in the morning at all, and it meant I actually got to sleep in, which was a godly blessing. But I thought, fill in the gap here with some football-related mindfulness. So I searched up football quotes and tried to find something that sounded a little bit mindful. Albert Camus, French novelist, philosopher type fellow from, when was he working? Like 40s, 50s probably. He said, "Everything I know about morality and the obligations of men, I owe it to football." And of course, when you say obligations of men, I feel whenever people do like the universal thing of using the word men, I feel like myself obligated to say like 2022. It just means people. We're not getting specific there. And also when he says he goes into football, I think it's very easy to say rugby league, cricket, boxing, UFC, like pick a sport. I think the same lessons are available to all. It's just this one happens to be mentioning football. But everything I know about morality and the obligations of men, I owe it to football. Albert Camus.
I can't lie. I was when you said like this morning was the first morning without dot dot dot. I was thinking, has there been a ram raid overnight? Like they seem to be happening every night. Like I think society is in a weird state. But you did say a FIFA World Cup game, which is probably a little more applicable. But I was pondering, like, is this one of the mornings where we didn't have a ram raid last night? Far out. Right.
Not where I live. At least not that I hear about. There's your problem.
Aotearoa sporting discussion continues. You did mention in the variety show Wildcard David Light, the latest Kiwi boxing hero. And just to elaborate on this, I think we can highlight some points about combat sport in Aotearoa, which, like, your mindfulness did revolve around football, which revolves around FIFA. So, like, I don't want to reject your mindfulness, but it is a bit weird. And you also mentioned the UFC. So, like, the UFC is equally as deep in shenanigans and antics. But the UFC is the biggest
the sport rather than the organizations. But yeah,
UFC is the biggest MMA thing, and that's where the best Kiwis are fighting. So that's where our focus here. And obviously, boxing is just the world of boxing, equally as perilous as football or the UFC. But there is
he did say everything he learns about morality. It doesn't necessarily mean all the good things he learns about morality as well. I guess you can learn the good things from the purity of the sport itself, and you learn a lot of the bad things from the organizations that govern them.
So David Light, like, we're coming into a little pocket here, Wildcard, where the best boxers were heavyweights. Whether it goes back to David Tua, I'm sure you can figure out some historical stuff as well. Big up to Aotearoa's illustrious combat sporting history. And there was Mark Hunt was leading the charge in the UFC, and he was also a heavyweight. I shout out to, I think, Justin Tuffer, who might still be in the UFC. Just double check that as I'm talking through it. But Justin Tuffer was in the UFC as of December 2021. He was also a heavyweight, who I think, it says here, catchweight, Tuffer missed weight. So I don't know if Tuffer missed weight for a heavyweight bout, which is a bit weird. But that is to say, a lot of the recent combat sports stuff for Aotearoa has been in the heavyweight division. Now we're shifting a little bit, Wildcard, because we do have David Light. And you said that he was in the same division as David Naika? Same weight class?
Yeah, cruiserweight. So the one directly below heavyweight. Yeah.
Yeah, so that is aligned with where the Aotearoa success in UFC is. Israel Adesanya is a middleweight. Carlos Ulberg is on the rise in the light heavyweight division. Dan Hook is one of the best lightweights, I think, in the world. So it seems like that is a pocket of Aotearoa's combat sport that is on fire at the moment, and it seems to have shifted away from the heavyweight division.
Yeah, and I suspect there have always been decent Kiwi boxers below the heavyweight division, but I mean, also, like, probably people who have done as much as Junior Fa got up to, like Progress Dafa or Hemia Hio as well. But because they were heavyweights, there's a bit more of a spectacle because it's sort of seen as because it's the uncapped division, like it's seen as the biggest, the strongest kind of competitors, the most glamorous in its own way. And Joseph Parker did win a world title as a heavyweight. Like, that happened. All three of those guys have been knocked out in their most recent fights, and none of them were very pretty. It's a little bit of a stumble from them. At the same time, we have seen David Nika. It's a steady rise. It's a slow, deliberate rise. Funny thing is, Nika and David Light, I think, both won Commonwealth games medals at the same games. It was the one before last, so that must have been like 2018 or 2014. I don't know exactly. I can't remember. But yeah, that happened. So I should check. I don't think they're in the same weight class there because it's a bit weird when amateurs they add in an extra super heavyweight division. So Nika fights as a heavyweight in the amateurs, but a cruiserweight in the pros because the heavyweights fight as super heavyweights in amateurs and then thing. But there must be some crossover. I mean, people can fluctuate their weight to hit it anyway. And cruiserweights, often you do see like the best cruiserweights get to the top of that division. They're like, right, well, what's next? Let's go heavyweight. And best example of that recently, Alexander Usyk. It was a cruiserweight dominating presence and moved up to heavyweights and also was really good there too. Beat Anthony Joshua a couple of times. So like that's, I mean, actually, you know, since we're talking about the comparisons there as well, that's something Adesanya did as well, isn't it? Like dominate his division and then move up, try on what did he go? Middleweight to light heavyweight, was it? Or
yes.
And then lost and went back and now has lost in the middleweights, but I'm sure there is a rematch down the line.
It's a similar thing. Like if you move up a weight class in boxing, like say you're a cruiserweight moving up to heavyweight and hypothetical, you're fighting Tyson Fury. Tyson Fury knows how to use all the extra size in a boxing ring against you. And it's the same thing Adesanya came up against with young Blackcaps. Hemi Ahio seems like the best, not the best, because I think Joseph Parker's still, you know, he's still doing his thing, but Hemi Ahio, he's a heavyweight boxer though, right?
Yeah, he is.
So we've got some, I think this is to say, end of 2022, Aotearoa's combat sporting mahi is as excellent as any other sport that we discuss. There might be some weaknesses, or maybe we just don't necessarily know so much about the female athletes. I think the best female MMA fighter is Gina Fabian, and she hasn't been that successful in the PFL. I'm sure there are some fantastic wahine boxers as well. But Aotearoa has a couple notable boxers, David Light, Hemi Ahio, David Naika, couple of Daves.
Well, Hemi Ahio is one of the dudes who got knocked out in his most recent fight as well. So he was on that trio, but
they're all good. They're all among the best in the world.
They're all good, and you can come back from one loss. It just sets you back a little bit.
Don't try downplay it. Like we're celebrating things here. Like Israel Adesanya just lost his last fight as well. Like he's still one of the best fighters in the world. Like this is Aotearoa sport, and it's important to say that the combat sporting stuff at the moment is pure ahi, not to mention the little bugger, Kai Kara France, one of the best in his division as well. So big up the Aotearoa combat sports scene. And funky note, this all starts very DIY grassrooty in Aotearoa. City Kickboxing, it's just a building in Auckland. And I'm sure they've come from very humble beginnings to now house and coach some of the best MMA fighters and boxers in the world. David Light's Camp Wildcard, do you have any more information about David Light's kind of training, setup, and coaching stuff in Aotearoa?
Yeah, not too much. He's trained by Isaac Peach out of Peach Boxing, which is in West Auckland, I think, sort of Henderson way. So, I mean, I saw a thing of their gym on the news the other day. It just sort of looks like a shed that's been turned into a gym, which is perfect. It's exactly what you're saying. It's like the DIY thing. It's not like in some sports to get to the top, you gotta jump on board an academy team really young and get involved in like where all the money goes and where all the attention and whatever goes. There is like City Kickboxing is the gold standard. But they're not alone. And this story with David Light, who is in contention, he's a mandatory challenger for the WBO cruiserweight title bout now, which if he gets that fight against Lawrence Okoli has done a lot of, like, he's fought on a lot of Anthony Joshua undercards and stuff. He's a pretty well-known name in the UK, if that ends up being like a co-main headline kind of thing on a fight with maybe Joshua, although I think there's been some shenanigans between Akoli and Anthony and Eddie Hearn, which I think means that he might not be ripped by them anymore, or there might not be a possibility. But like maybe he gets on board a Tyson Fury fight or something as a co-main against like Fury Usyk or whatever. That's not out of the question. It's not necessarily going to happen, and that fight itself might not necessarily happen because he might choose a unification bout instead. But if it does, David Light would go from training in a gym in Henderson to potentially, as I say, this isn't out of the question. He could be fighting at Wembley or O2 or Cardiff or something in front of like 80,000 people. That is in the realms of possibility for what might happen coming out of basically a DIY gym in West Auckland. Like that's the big time. to get from there to there, there's actually not that many sports you can do that in. But for some reason, Kiwi combat sports, we're talking about this like the wave that's going on. So much of it is from that DIY aesthetic mentality as well. It's just like guys are just out there and doing the work themselves and going a long way with it.
And when you hear the stories about city kickboxing through their rise, like just going to China and staying in the cheapest rooms you can find and all that type of stuff just to build up your mana, it's all there. And it's just part of Aotearoa's sporting excellence wildcard. We have a Breakers game tonight. So the New Zealand Breakers are playing against the Sydney Kings this evening, Thursday. I think it's a 7:30 kickoff. It is in Auckland at the Spark Arena, which is the glitz and the glam. We're talking about DIY, grit and grindy Aotearoa sports. I think the arena on the North Shore is the big one where it's like this is Breakers territory, and it's the same thing at the Spark Arena. You still get like it's very loud, it's hostile for touring teams. Just lacks the of the North Shore Arena. Sydney Kings are first, so the Breakers are playing the best team in the NBL so far. Big game Thursday night. You're going to be writing about them during this upcoming break. They basically have a week off, so you've got some time to digest Breakers things. What's just one thing you're looking for in this game with your upcoming yarn in mind? Is there a trend or theme that you've been pondering that you just want to see in this game, or just something to keep an eye on in this game with your upcoming yarn in mind?
To be honest, like because I forgot I had written this, but I did write before the season sort of a cautiously optimistic Breakers article, which was a bit of a digression to how I've had to write about them for a couple of years leading into that. It was nice to be able to be like, you know what? I kind of like this decision and that decision. And I agree with what the coach is saying. And I think these are good positive signs heading forward. But I was very, very skeptical that a team that's been pretty trash for 4 years is going to suddenly become like a title contender all at once. So when they won for a couple games early on, I'm thinking, sweet, keep it up. And they won for a couple more. Thinking, sweet, keep going though. I'm still not convinced. And then they went on like a 6 or 7 or 8 game winning streak or something like that. And through that stage, I'm like, all right, I believe it now. And one of the main reasons I believe it is because it's the same thing every time that's getting them through. It's a really good defense, their top-notch import recruitment, and a very impressive head coach. And it's still really weird. Like it's the anomaly that I can't figure out is why Manuleleua was an assistant to Dan Shamir when they were crap, and then he takes over from him, and now they're really good. Like that doesn't seem like, I don't know. It's just like, was he buried in that regime, or what's going on, or how? Like, it's a strange one that was the case. But he's absolutely emerged with that responsibility, and he's thriving, and the team is thriving underneath him. So I think the consistency of getting them to this point means that there's not really anything new or different to look for. I think the exciting thing about this game is that it is a top of the table clash. And if you want to win an NBL title, which I think at this point, with the record they have after 15 games or whatever it is, I think that has to be your target. You have to be aiming to win the whole thing at this point. You're not just hoping to make the finals and end your 4-season playoff drought. It's like, no, you get to the finals, you want to start winning some games. You want to win. You want to make the final itself, and then you want to beat whoever you come up against there and lift a trophy. So playing against the team that is probably the best team in the NBL, I think you can safely say like the Kings are slightly ahead of the Breakers and also have a couple games fewer that they've played, so potentially could extend that out. But these are the two best. Like if the Kings are first, the Breakers are second in terms of the table itself, but also in terms of how they've been playing. I think that's the thing from this game tonight is just like let's see what the Breakers look like in what could be a preview of the finals. In a few months down the line, like that could be the case. That is probably the gambler's pick right now would be Breakers versus Kings. Well, here's the chance for the Breakers to play the Kings and make a statement, get a look at how they play, and maybe whoop them a little bit. We'll see if that happens. How does your defense hold up against the best team? Here's your opportunity to show that.
They are the only two teams with a winning percentage over 70. So that tells you the story of the strength of these two teams. I've been thinking about something I heard in my perusal of sports coverage, and it was this idea about like when there's a new coach, especially someone who's like new to head coaching, you got to look at what their specialty was prior to getting a head coach role. So the easiest example,
the Seraldo thing again.
Exactly. So the easiest example is like NFL. If you got a defensive coordinator and he becomes an NFL head coach, you got to look at the defense. Like, is he able to do what he is best at doing? Is the team good defensively? Because if you were a defensive coordinator, basically the assistant coach in charge of defense, and you become a head coach and your defense sucks, what are you hanging your hat on as a coach? So, Warriors, Bulldogs example, you'd hope the Bulldogs, if you're a Bulldogs fan, you're looking at Cameron Seraldo making the Bulldogs a strong defensive team because he was instrumental in the Panthers being a good defensive team. I was tongue-in-cheek about the revolution of Panthers attack under Andrew Webster. Like, let's be honest, it's not necessarily all him, but that's what he did. That's what made him successful as an assistant coach at the Panthers. And assessing him as a head coach, I'm going to be looking at the Warriors' attack. Can the Warriors score points with him as the head coach? Maybe Mody Maor was he was in charge of the defense under Dan Shamir as an assistant coach. Like, we don't have that information, but it was clear at the start of the season he wanted certain defensive standards met. Yeah, and he had done a lot of historical mahi, like looking at the champions of the previous years, their defense and so on. So I am curious if that might have been the case where his greatest attribute is defensively, and now you're seeing that laid out with him as the head coach.
Well, one thing we do know about Mody Maor is when he was like his time as the assistant, like one thing that was highlighted a lot is I guess there was a lot of stuff about his very vibrant personality and how expressive he was and whatever, but there was also like a few details about how, when RJ Hampton was there, it was Mody Maor who was given a lot of credit for, I don't think we saw RJ Hampton actually, because he was injured for the second half of the season and then he just went home early to prepare for the NBA draft rather than sticking it out or anything like that. And the team got way better when he wasn't there, but it was mentioned definitely that Mody was the dude who was very hands-on with his development. And I think that's probably been the case, not only with a lot of their other young players that they brought through, like being the dude who gets like, puts an arm around him and says like, here's the thing, try this, try that. Well, you're pulling your shot a little bit. Why don't you try this or think, like little specifics like that. But it also, I suspect, because Dan Shamir was an interesting dude, and I quite liked him in a lot of ways. He wasn't a successful basketball coach for that team. It did seem like maybe he was quite cold at times, like maybe not the dude who would be friends with the players, whereas I think Modi is the opposite. He does seem like the kind of guy who'd get on, and it is a bit different now that he's a head coach, because you can see a bit of a distance. I think he's really embracing that responsibility with how he speaks and how he conducts himself, and it's actually been one of the most impressive things about that rise is just how mature and level-headed he really has been. I think he's been an outstanding coach in that regard. But I do also think that point that was made about, like, it's basically, this is your point that you were saying, like, what were they doing there? Well, one thing that we know he was doing a lot of is being the team spirit kind of guy, like keep people's heads up, be friendly, get the right kind of team culture vibes going. Well, that's clear as day from watching the Breakers this season compared to last season. Like, it's maybe the most notable difference, even before you get into like the rediscovered defensive identity, or getting more in touch with the like Kiwi history of the club and whatever, and the various values that entails. I think maybe the biggest difference, the first thing you would notice if you watched a game from last year and a game from this year and nobody told you which one was which, and you just sort of had to blindly guess. Last year, everyone looked miserable. This year, everyone looks like they're loving it. Like, as simple as that, you know?
To continue the theme, I think that might be something to watch out for with the Warriors as well.
That is absolutely, yeah.
And it's a lot easier to rip in defensively, do the hard mahi and attack, the jobs no one sees but everyone appreciates. It's a lot easier to do that stuff when you're having a jolly old time. If you're not happy, not a happy chappy, you're going to be, kicking up a stink. And if you're not kicking up a stink, you're probably having a little tantrum about, oh, I don't want to defend and blah, blah, blah. And it kind of seeps into the culture and poor performances.
Well, you got Barry Brown Jr., import level player, and I think might even be the top scorer for the team, is playing off the bench for the Breakers. And he loves it. Like, he doesn't care. That's as good of example of that as you can get.
Loves the chat as well. We have noted the like, it is good that the Breakers, like, I think they're just the niggly team to play against, and I think that's a good thing. And I think it's something else that, again, Warriors, Phoenix, like whoever it is, we are Kiwis, but you don't want to fuck around with the Kiwis. Like, they will bite at your ankles. Like, they can't fly, but they will pick at your ankles. So you better be wearing shin pads when you're around the Kiwis. I just imagine like someone going out and like, yeah, we're going into Kiwi territory. Better strap on your shin pads as they're coming for your ankles. They're going to peck at your ankles.
With the long socks.
Aotearoa Cricket Wildcard. We've got Ford Trophy happening as we speak. Just watched Matt Henry snare his second Ford Trophy wicket. Stat from the variety show reference there. He just dismissed Rachin Ravindra. Got some big Donnies playing. Tim Southey's playing for Northern District. So Ford Trophy is rocking and rolling. Before, I do want to do a little bit on the White Ferns wildcard, because they just finished their T20 series against Bangladesh. However, I just want to throw up this idea about the Kiwis who are going to play Big Bash League, especially now that we've got confirmation of the teams they're going to be playing and who's going to be playing where. Jimmy Neesham's going to be playing for Hobart. Martin Guptill's going to be playing for the Melbourne Renegades. Trent Bolt's playing for the Melbourne Stars. Con de Gronholm is playing for the Adelaide Strikers. I think this is going to be fascinating. I think this is going to be a fascinating month, 2 months, maybe 3 months if we stretch it out to the England Test Series in Aotearoa for all Kiwi cricket. So the White Ferns are preparing for a T20 World Cup. And it's all about the Super Smash. Like, we have our premier T20 competition to lead into that T20 World Cup. Men's cricket, you've got this, like, these Kiwis in the Big Bash League. You got Ford Trophy. You've got a lot of very interesting international cricket coming up as well. Obviously, the men's Super Smash, which is happening at the same time as the Big Bash. So those dudes won't be playing Super Smash. I don't know how successful these dudes are going to be in the BBL. Like, I think there's a chance Trent Bolt's really good. But I just, like, this isn't really based on anything. It's just a vibe. It's just a gut feel. You want them to do well, but also I'm not sure people are checking on the T20 mercenary types too often. And I'll throw this out there as a reference, like how many people listening to this and yourself, Wildcard, were really tapped in with what Colin Munro was doing around the world in T20 cricket. I would go a step further, and I kind of reference these quite a bit just to build up the context around individuals' performance, but most people wouldn't know how many Kiwis or which Kiwis are playing in England's T20 Blast every winter. And I would also suggest that many Kiwi cricket fans don't necessarily know what's happening in the IPL with the Kiwi lads either. So I do have this idea of out of sight, out of mind, which keeps coming to my mind about these Kiwis who are going to be playing in the BBL. And I don't know if they're quite... Like obviously, they're doing it for their careers, they're making money and whatnot, but juxtaposed against like Tom Latham in Aotearoa, even someone like Ish Sodhi playing for Canterbury, Tim Southey still playing for Northern Districts. You've got all these Blackcaps who are still going to be performing front and center in Aotearoa. Personally, I'm a bit down on this Kiwi BBL group, and I'm curious about what it means for them moving forward, especially when you consider like Martin Guptill's going BBL because he was replaced by Finn Allen. Jimmy Neesham didn't play in those T20 internationals against India, right?
The ODIs he didn't play. I think he played the T20s. Play is a relative word as well.
Yeah. Sorry, because
held some umbrellas.
I was more tapped in with the ODIs against India. He had 2 ducks against India in the T20 internationals, and Jimmy Neesham has 5 scores under 10 in his last 6 innings of T20 batting. So that you can like
a lot of which includes a World Cup.
Correct. Colin de Grandhomme, he retired because he wasn't apparently good enough to be in the T20 international team. Like Trent Bolt's the only dude, and he's in the BBL because he's so good. He's kind of ascended beyond the restrictions to play BBL. Neesham, Guptill, and de Grandhomme's retired, so that's different to Guptill and Neesham. But those dudes aren't necessarily first 11 T20 international cricketers right now. You can, of course, you can debate this. You can spin a yarn about all the details here, but I'm just setting this up as I'm curious as to how these guys perform in the BBL. Not to mention, it's not easy to perform in the BBL. Like, these are very serious Australian cricketers, some of the best T20 players in the world. And if Neesham's coming off a T20 World Cup, as you said, last 4 games, well, they were all in Australia, and he had scores of 26 not out, 5, 6, 0, and 16 not out. So it might not be as good as he is hoping. And for the Kiwi cricket fan, I just don't know if they're going to be checking on those dudes in the same way that a lot of Kiwi cricket fans are checking on domestic cricket, because that's in Aotearoa. And Super Smash is going to be on TV. It's going to be highly visible for everyone to see. That's where I think the focus is going to be. So it's just an interesting little juncture.
Yeah, on TV, and also like you can just go to the games. They're there, and the Super Smash in the summer. It's one thing, like the high performance level of how New Zealand cricket have like the perspective of how New Zealand cricket have sort of set up their Super Smash to where, you know, it collides with the Big Bash, and therefore contracted players who have to be available for New Zealand cricket organized fixtures ahead of anything else, therefore cannot play in the Big Bash, which is of a higher standard and perhaps better for them as players to play in those things. But also, like, aside from that high performance thing, there is some good momentum, and I don't necessarily know that New Zealand cricket get the bulk of the credit for it. I think actually Spark has probably done more work to build up the Super Smash as a thing. They spent a lot of money on getting that cricket coverage, and have to make it work beyond just Blackcaps stuff, which they've done very good work with. I think White Ferns games, giving them a level of coverage that didn't exist before that broadcast deal changed. Super Smash was still being played on Sky beforehand, but I think there is still momentum growing with that, partly just because I think the standard of cricket in this country is higher than it's probably ever been. So the Super Smash is a better competition by definition than it's ever been before. And you do, because the Blackcaps aren't going to be playing for a lot of that. So there is a test tour to Pakistan that will overlap with it, but the test players aren't necessarily the dudes. Like there will be first 11 Black Caps players who are getting games across the Super Smash season. So all of that's pretty cool. I wonder, yeah, I do wonder about the thing because the Big Bash, I think, had momentum 5 years ago. And it feels like maybe it's lost some of that. I don't know why that is. I don't know if it's just where we are, it's different, but in Australia, it's the same. But as it ever was, I don't know. But I think you're probably right in that I don't know that's necessarily the first place people will be thinking to check in. And it's a bit of a shame about that because like Trent Bolt's really, really good. And I think I'm extremely curious to see how Martin Guptill goes playing over there. And I think Jimmy Neesham as well is in a very peculiar spot in his just in his career, basically, because he didn't get that contract from New Zealand cricket initially. And the thing was that they didn't have him ranked high enough as an ODI player. Therefore, he didn't make the top 20 or whatever. And then by the time someone else cleared up, it might have even been Bolt or de Grandhomme's contracts came up for grabs. Neesham had already signed other deals and it's like, well, I can't go back on that now. That's a legal repercussion. So couldn't accept that. But then it seems like maybe he is just not first choice ODI now. Like, because the funny thing is they said he wasn't first choice ODI, didn't give him a contract, and then he basically played every ODI for like the rest of that year until this India series. That team looked all right without him. Like, he hasn't been bowling that well, and his batting has slipped up from where he had a really good 12 months previous to that T20 World Cup. A lot of really good, like just being the closer, the dude who comes in at the end of the innings, smacks the ball hard, hits boundaries. I think his innings in the T20 World Cup semi-final the previous time against England was outrageously good, like coming in alongside Daryl Mitchell, hitting a couple boundaries, doing the perfect Jimmy Neesham role. Like I can't remember what he got, probably like 30 or 15 or something. Just scoring at a really high strike rate and hitting the fence. Haven't seen that quite as much from him recently, and at the same time his bowling has dipped off kind of substantially to where he was never the best bowler, but he could pick up a wicket. Like dudes would try see him as the release bowler and he'd just do enough to like cheeky slower balls or bounces or whatever. It'd do enough to get wickets. Wickets have dried up. That exposes his RPO. He hasn't really been bowling that much. As a result, I don't even think he bowled at the T20 World Cup. They've just used the same 5 bowlers the whole time. He kind of needs a big bash. And even if he gets a big bash, it might not make a difference. Like they might have just moved on from him in the way that if they moved on from Martin Guptill, they can move on from Jimmy Neesham. So he's in a curious spot as well there. And de Grandhomme's just always fun to watch. So like all 4 of those guys are kind of box office things. And the timing of the Big Bash games is not bad. The game's starting at like 9 p.m. on a summer evening. It's a decent one, especially if Guptill's batting first. You turn on, watch the first innings kind of thing. But yeah, I'm curious to see how much coverage that gets,
Not curious about the coverage at all. I'm curious about the players and what they do. Jimmy Neesham has 1 score over 20 in his last 10 games.
That's not good.
Of course, Jimmy Neesham bats down the order in T20 cricket. He's not necessarily going to be smacking 30s, 40s. He's never hit a 50. So it's all about strike rate, but he does have just 1 score over 20 in his last 10 games, and he has only bowled in 1 game out of his last 10 games as well.
Right. That's what I was going to ask next.
Reinforce your points there. Quick exercise wildcard. Guptill is replaced by Allen. Okay. De Grandhomme's retired. He's been wishy-washy for a while, so there's not necessarily one player we can look to as a replacement. Neesham, who's the one player that benefits from his absence?
Michael Bracewell.
Ooh.
I think quite well. It might depend a little bit on format, but I think Michael Bracewell is the dude who stands the.
This is all T20s.
He's the one who stands to gain the most.
Trent Bolt
in 2020s again.
Correct.
I don't know. maybe Tim Southey in a funny way.
Mm.
I think Southey would already play, but I think now he gets to be like the king of the bowling lineup in a way. Bolt will still play now and then, but he won't
That's just
necessarily
for the
play a lot of
exercise.
T20s for a while. So yeah, I, I I don't know that there isn't an exact replacement for Bolt. So I think maybe the question has to be answered slightly differently, which is why I'm leaning Southey there.
Well, Southey is the direct benefactor. Let's be honest.
But he would be playing alongside Bolt anyway in the T20 team. Maybe not so much in the ODI. I think he's definitely the benefactor in ODI cricket.
It's all good.
But yeah.
White Ferns wrapped up their series against Bangladesh. Bangladesh are a cricketing nation and women's cricket on the rise, not necessarily in the same realm as the White Ferns. The White Ferns, one of the best T20 teams in the world. Straight up. Only Australia has a better record. They are 8-0. I think the White Ferns are 10-3-1. White Ferns have a win percentage of 3.33. Australia don't have a win-loss ratio because they only win games.
Infinity.
And Australia and Aotearoa are the only T20 international women's teams with a win-loss ratio above 2. So that tells you what the White Ferns are doing right now. Did mention the Maddie Green wicket-keeping situation. I think that is a fantastic wrinkle. But also, Maddie Green and Amelia Kerr have elevated their batting to the point where, like, Amelia Kerr is one of the best batters in the world. Period. You could say she is a better batter than Sophie Devine and Susie Bates in both formats. Like, I don't think that's a drastic thing to say right now. I think it's going to be true in the next 2 years. But Amelia Kerr's a serious batter, and if we're talking about Jimmy Neesham's last few games in which he has one score over 20 and he's bowled in one game, you go to Amelia Kerr's profile, she has 4 consecutive scores over 20 in her last 4 T20 games, 3 of which are scores over 40. In Amelia Kerr's last 10 games, Women's Big Bash League and T20 Internationals, she only has 3 single-digit scores. Amelia Kerr is genuinely one of the best batters in the world. Maddie Green just had her best. Amelia Kerr just had her best Women's Big Bash League batting, so that flowed into the series. Also averaging like 59 in ODI cricket this year. Maddie Green also had her best Women's Big Bash League campaign, and Maddie Green and Amelia Kerr are the only White Ferns batters in T20 international cricket this year averaging over 30. And they also have strike rates over 110. So when you put them together with Susie Bates and Sophie Devine, you have 4 batters in T20 international cricket this year who are averaging over 25 with strike rates over 100. That is the crux of a good T20 international team when you also put in together with 6 bowlers who have over 10 wickets with averages below 25, conceding less than 6.5 runs and over. Those are very basic markers in assessing a T20 international team, and the White Ferns have those foundations established right now ahead of a T20 World Cup. And I don't say this lightly. Again, like, have been critical of women's cricket in Aotearoa. Have been critical of the White Ferns as an ODI team. Was critical about the previous regime. Right now, the White Ferns are one of the best T20 international teams in the world, and there's a bit of variety there. There's no lefty batters, but Sophie Devine goes about her business slightly different to the other 3. Amelia Kerr's slightly different to Maddie Green. Maddie Green's slightly different to Susie Bates. They all can hit in awkward areas, or in Amelia Kerr's case, just like everywhere with class. Susie Bates is always anything short, she's going to pull it. She's always looking for dinky shots as well. Then you go to the bowlers. Fran Jonas is the only lefty, but she is like freakishly economical. Eden Carson. Fran Jonas isn't one of the best fielders in the team, straight up. Eden Carson is one of the best fielders in the team, also as a teenage spinner. Amelia Kerr, I just said the 10 wickets below 25 average, 6.5 RPO. Amelia Kerr is the only one of those bowlers with an average over 20. So in a situation where Amelia Kerr is the worst bowler of that group, that's awesome because she's really good at bowling. It was Leah Tahuhu who was the worst bowler of that group, but she took 8 wickets in favourable conditions, and that was good confidence boost for her because Leah Tahuhu and Sophie Devine, they can both bowl bouncers. Hayley Jensen, Sophie Devine, and Leah Tahuhu, they all swing the ball. Like, this is the foundation of a good T20 international team, and it was all on display against Bangladesh. Bangladesh, plucky opponents, but I don't think they were going to challenge the White Ferns in any of those games. And this flows into Super Smash, where Lauren Down needs to demand selection. Georgia Plummer probably needs to demand selection as well. I think Rebecca Burns, just her power and her attacking instincts puts her ahead of some of those other role-playing batters, but she'll also need a strong Super Smash campaign. And then you're looking at like the supporting bowlers. Jess Kerr's only played 5 games this year, but she was highly efficient and effective in her 5 games. And you can play her alongside the 6 other bowlers, Devine, Jensen, Tahuhu, Kerr, Amelia Kerr, that is, Fran Jonas, and Eden Carson. You can also play Jess Kerr in the same lineup, or you can go with the extra batter. And then below that, you're looking at someone like Hannah Rowe, probably has the skill set to push for T20 World Cup selection as well. And I think, again, these are the foundations of a good T20 international team.
With the T20 World Cup coming up relatively shortly too. And I mean, there's some of those 2022 stats like that includes the Commonwealth Games as well. And there were some tricky fixtures there. It's not just a matter of players have padded their stats against a touring Bangladesh team who had never played a bilateral series in New Zealand before, which apparently was true, which is interesting. When you look at their men's team, how long have Bangladesh been coming here, their men's cricket team? They'd never won a game of any format up until that test match victory last summer. Like, what's that, like 20 years or whatever? I don't know how long Bangladesh has been, at least 15 years. They've been touring here and had never won a game of any of the 3 formats against the Blackcaps until then. So obviously the women's team was going to struggle the first time but they were here for the World Cup last year, but it's the first time they've had like a bilateral series against the White Ferns. Clearly that's tricky. And there was definitely some stat padding against them. But like, the thing about cricket stats is you're supposed to pad your stats against the more favorable oppositions. Like, you're meant to do that. That's how it works. Brian Lara averaged more against the Zimbabwe and Bangladesh or whatever, and probably New Zealand, than he did against Australia or India. You know, it's the same for every batter. Of course, you're going to score more in the better things, and you should. And if you don't pad your stats against the weaker teams, your stats look terrible, because you're not going to pad them against the better teams if you can't do it against the weaker teams, right? And I think there's probably a few players, Maddie Greenfield's like one, for example, who probably needed to give her T20 average a little bit of a boost to better reflect where she is these days as a player compared to where she had been in the past. And when you're a team that picks a lot of players who aren't quite ready necessarily for the level and have to develop still at the highest level, as the White Ferns have been for a few years, they've tried to do that. Sometimes by necessity, sometimes overthinking it, I suspect. But when that's the case, obviously your first few years of international cricket aren't going to look fantastic on the stats. So when you get the opportunity to cash in, you want to do that. So like Maddie Green just did. She scored a bunch of runs against Bangladesh. Leah Tahu took a bunch of wickets and helped sort of reassert her form at a time where maybe her career could have been going in the opposite direction towards retirement. When she wasn't given a contract, comes back in and takes some wickets, forces her way back in, proves her worth to the team again. There you go. T20 World Cup on the horizon. Like, you're you're meant to score runs and take wickets against a touring Bangladesh team who don't have a lot of experience in that situation, and you're likely to win these games. You're supposed to cash in, and a lot of players did, which is very good to see.
Everything you said is fair, but everything I talked about was 2022. It was Women's Big Bash League. Like, you got to go like. The pad your stats just sounds negative, so I've never used that term. Like, you need to perform, you need to win games for your country. It doesn't matter who the opponent is. So I don't use that like terminology, but because that implies that you are making decisions purely to boost your stats, which I don't think any of these players are doing. So that's just a linguistic, semantic type of thing. But the White Ferns have played 7 different countries this year. They played England twice at the Commonwealth Games. They played Australia at the Commonwealth Games. They played 5 games against the West Indies, but in the West Indies. Like, none of this is like all tricky of this tour, is again. I don't say this lightly. Like, I don't bring up the 2022 stats lightly. They have played nearly every nation, and they're 10-3. They have. Their best batters have all scored runs. And if there is like a lack of performance against the best teams, I bring up Maddie Green's Women's Big Bash League, where she was really good, and that flowed into the series. And it's very measured in how to bring up these performances. And like, again, Amelia Kerr was not out in those games against Bangladesh. And those are game-winning performances that you have to appreciate. Yes, seam bowling against the touring Asian team is not easy. Seam bowling against touring Asian teams usually leads to wickets for the Kiwi seamers, regardless of who they are, to be honest. But also, Leah Tahuhu hasn't been in great form, and you need to win games for your country regardless of who the opponent is. So this is a good team. It just smoked Bangladesh as they should, and are preparing for a T20 World Cup where I think they can be competing for the top 3 slots, if not a final.
Where is the T20 World Cup?
South also Africa.
When, if you know? South Africa. Interesting.
So a bit of everything, maybe a bit of spin, but Leah Tahuhu might shine on the harder tracks in South Africa as well. Don't think the White Ferns have toured South Africa recently, which could be the only kind of tricky bit there. Football wildcard. We have 2 Wellington Phoenix games this weekend, but we also have National League stuff. So the men's is all finished. We've done a lot of content on that. So maybe just for this podcast and the last phase of this podcast here, we'll just focus on the Women's National League. There is one more regular season round before the final. Is everything sorted for the final, or is there a bit to play for this weekend?
No, we're all sorted for the final. Any remaining hope that Eastern Suburbs booked their spot last week. Western Springs lost last week unexpectedly to Capital, which left them in a situation where had Northern Rovers beaten Eastern Suburbs, then that could have gotten a little bit frisky going into the last 2 rounds for Western Springs. But Eastern Suburbs beat Northern Rovers 4-2 in a pretty thrilling game, which actually wasn't really as close as it sounds. It was 2 outrageously good goals from Rovers. This is the week before last. So that meant coming into the second to last week, Western Springs just needed to win one of their remaining 2 games. They'd be in the final. They were playing Central, bottom team of the table, were coming off their first win of the season. Big upset against Southern United the week before. But Western Springs at Seddon Fields is different gravy, and Western Springs won that game 9-0. So they're in the final. Eastern Suburbs are in the final. Eastern Suburbs won their first 10 games of the season. It might have even been first 11 games of the season. I can't remember. No, 10. And they've been brilliant. But they went to Southern United on the weekend, and they lost. And they lost picking up what looked like potentially 4 starting player injuries as well, including to Taylor O'Brien, who is the MVP in waiting, basically. She's been the best player all season. She's the top goal scorer by a big margin, one of the top assist makers as well, just the best player, full stop. Went off injured, looked in a fair bit of pain, had the ice strapped on her ankle from sitting on the bench there for the rest of that game. That's a big concern. Ella Finlay as well, under 20s international, looked like she suffered quite a bad injury. She was getting quite a lot of treatment. So I'm not sure if that was ankle or knee, but that one looked quite serious, which is very, is not what you want to hear, basically. I think Olivia Page went off injured early, and Aria Blacklow was a late scratch from the starting thing, which also meant that when Finlay went off with 4 injuries, and the reserve goalkeeper on the bench, there was no one to bring on. Like, either you bring on the goalie to play centre back or something like that, or whatever, or you just finish with 10 women. So they had to finish with 10, and that's how Southern scored late on. Not necessarily the only reason. Southern played very well in that game, but there could be some lingering. Like, ordinarily, you go down there, tricky game, you already qualified for the final, no dramas. But when you do that, like, you shrug off a loss in normal circumstances, but when you do that, when you also pick up potentially 4 injuries to players who will all be in contention to start for your team in a grand final in a fortnight, suddenly that goes from being, oh, well, not that important, we're focusing on the one that matters, to, oh shit, it's not good, especially if your best player is potentially going to miss time. I don't think O'Brien looked too bad. Like, she walked off unassisted, and she's in a bit of pain, but like, I suspect they subbed her immediately because they're just like, no risks. We're not taking any risks here. We've had an injury scare, and we're not thinking any more about that. And Devon Jackson didn't play that game, so I think she comes back in and can at least fill some of that thing. Even in the worst case scenario of Taylor O'Brien not playing, it'd still have potentially the next best attacker this season. But it does open things up because Western Springs had a bit of a shaky stretch of form as well. And I think, Rena Hirano getting a couple goals against Central was good. Snapped like a 5 or 6 game streak of her not scoring. Sofia Garcia's come back into form, scoring a bunch of goals. She had a crazy duel with Sophie Campbell on the weekend, the goalkeeper for Central, where it's just like Garcia was playing amazingly and she just couldn't score a goal. Every time, it was just a great save here, great save there. She was in her head a bit because she dribbled around the keeper at one point and took it out for a goal kick, where it's like, that's her trademark move. She goes around the keeper, slots it into an empty net. She's done that like 3 or 4 times this season. She messed it up there against a 15-year-old goalkeeper for Central, who had a fantastic game. Might be the keeper for my team of the week in the newsletter, on Substack newsletter on Friday. We'll see how that goes. So Western Springs may be coming into a bit of form at the right time, and Eastern Suburbs potentially having a couple injuries. Guess what? They play each other this week in the last round of the regular season. So I wouldn't be surprised if Eastern Suburbs rest everybody, because they're just like, we're not risking another injury. And Western Springs might just want to go out there and thrash the Eastern Suburbs second 11, or maybe Eastern Suburbs will pick their best team and be like, no, we can't lose momentum. We lost last week. We're not risking that again. Who knows? Like, there's a few different, the game itself is meaningless, but it's a fascinating game because there's so many little wrinkles around it, where it's like, how does each team approach it? Which players get selected? Do you rest some? Are there lingering injuries? We'll see who, like, if Olivia Page or whoever, or Aria Blacklow plays this game for Eastern Suburbs, okay, so the injuries aren't so bad. They'll be in contention for the final as well. Like, and how do, like, just Western Springs want to go out there and make a statement? Eastern Suburbs want to make a statement, even though knowing that they'll play each other again a week later at Mount Smart Stadium again. They've announced the final will be at Mount Smart there for the women, as well as same place where the men played. So fascinating game that has no meaning to the table. Like, Eastern Suburbs can't even be that. Springs can't catch them for first place either. That's already guaranteed for Suburbs. Like, there's nothing to gain in terms of competition points or anything. But it's fascinating because the two teams are going to play again a week later in the grand final, where there's everything to gain.
Let's wind this podcast up, which sounds like an escalation, but it also let's wind it up. Let's wrap it up with Wellington Phoenix wildcard, as Wellington seem to be crumbling as per the summer in the Ford Trophy, 45 for 5, and we got Auckland, also not the strongest batting lineup or batting performances this season. They are 62 for 3. So shout out to the Ford Trophy. Shout out to the Wellington Phoenix. The women face Canberra United at 5 p.m. But these times, I'm not sure if these times are New Zealand time or Australian time. Shout out to the NRL draw. All those times are converted for New Zealand time, which is beautiful. NBL had to do that myself, 5:30 to 7:30. The women are playing at 5 p.m. Not sure when that is. On Saturday against Canberra United. The men, Wellington Phoenix men, are playing against Western Sydney Wanderers. Also in Australia at 7 p.m. So it might be 5 p.m. for the women, 9 p.m. for the men. Who knows? But both of those games are being played.
5 p.m., 7 p.m. NZ time. Just checked it.
Those games are both happening on Saturday evening. Obviously, the women wildcard are just battling at the moment. Let's see where Canberra United are on the ladder. Also battling. They got 2 draws from their first 2 games, so not sure what's going to happen there with the woman wildcard. Is there reason to think that they might get a dub? Like, is it a case of getting some best players on the park, like getting a first 11 on the park and competing, or what's doing there with the women against Canberra United?
Yeah, hopefully players like Emma Ralston and Grace Wisniewski will at least be in contention to make the squad. 90 minutes probably be a little beyond each of them potentially, but that doesn't really matter because what it seems like, I mean, where were we? They were 0-0 at halftime of their first game, right? And went on to lose 4-1. They were 1-0 at halftime of their second game, went on to lose 4-1. They were 0-0 a minute before halftime against a victory on the weekend and conceded in stoppage time. So 1-0 down at halftime. Went on to lose 1-0, so better second half performance against a team that seems to have a few, I don't know why the Victory aren't scoring goals, but they're not. It seems to be a problem for them. They've scored 1 goal in 3 games. Defensively, very good, which kept the Claudia Bunch at the back there and returning Kayla Morrison this year. So, like, didn't really give the Phoenix much of a chance to push for a result. But, I mean, if you got Emma Ralston coming back from injury, can play 25 minutes off the bench at the end of a game, maybe they do have the capacity to push for a late equalizer in that game. But like maybe that changes it. Grace Wisniewski's energy off the bench, if you can chuck her on, considering how like the exhausting the heat was there, I think it was another factor why they couldn't really push late on. You saw Alyssa Winham went off with heat stroke at one point, didn't look too good, but should be something she can recover from when she's rehydrated again and all that. So don't think she'd necessarily be in danger to miss this game, but it just goes to show as well. And they are in Australia again, so it's something that could happen. Canberra's not as steamy, I don't think, as Melbourne would have been last week, but still, like, it's the early in the season as well. You're not probably in full match fitness yet. You want the strongest bench possible to be able to push for results late in games, and they've been goal difference of -1 in first halves so far this season against 3 pretty good teams. That's solid. They're starting well. They're fading in second halves, fading in 2 different ways, fading once in terms of fitness and twice in terms of just conceding too many dumb goals in a big hurry. But yeah, I think you get a couple more of their better play. Well, better player, I don't know. You just strengthen the team by bringing players who have been missing so far from injury. It makes a difference. And Canberra, probably the most vulnerable team they've played so far. First team that they've played so far that's not from Melbourne, I believe, after playing City, Victory, and Western United. So Canberra, a team that seems to leak a few goals. They've also got the capacity to score a few, so that's dangerous. The Phoenix will need to be pretty sharp defensively, I think, in that game. But not the least of which against Grace Jale, who I think has scored in both the first 2 games of this season. I think she scored in like 4 games in a row to finish last season. I think she's actually scored in 6 consecutive games. I don't know what the record is, but I'm sure that's already a record for a New Zealand player. But they didn't play last week because they had the bye. She's refreshed. Canberra's refreshed from that. Like, she's an ex-Phoenix player. Potentially their most I don't know about most dangerous, but definitely a player you got to keep very, very close contact on. it's a tricky one, but I do think it's a game where maybe they're better poised to be able to get a result than the three pretty difficult fixtures they've had so far.
Worth noting, Wildcard, that there are 11 teams in the Women's A-League, and only 4 teams have 2 wins, at least 2 wins from their first 3 games. So, like, there are other teams who have yet to get a win. 4 teams are yet to win a game in the A-League Women's. Western Sydney Wanderers are also 2 losses from their 2 games. So I think that, combined with your first half nugget there, and what we know about this Phoenix women's team and how they're I think they're building and growing into the season, I think those are some signs of just chill out with the Wellington Phoenix women, let them brew, let them simmer in the A-League women's competition, and see where they wind up, because they are 0-3, but as I said, there are 3 other teams who are yet to win a game, and only 4 of 11 teams have won 2 out of their 3 games so far. So it is a weird competition. I don't know how else to describe it. It is a bit weird. The men facing the Wanderers, Western Sydney Wanderers, who are second on the ladder. The blokes are 8th on the ladder. And as we know, kind of the story so far this season, a lot of looking good, a lot of moments of excitement and hope about the Wellington Phoenix men and what they could do this season. Just yet to really have a commanding performance. And I don't know if it's going to flip around with the return of the A-League. A-League men definitely returning this weekend, Wildcard.
Yeah, we've got that one certain.
That is certain. No false alarm here this week.
Yeah, okay, Saturday at 7 p.m. We've
the Wellington
just
Phoenix
double checking to make sure. Yeah,
they are coming back this weekend, and they kind of need to start winning games and translating encouraging, exciting performances into dubs. Not sure if it's going to happen against Western Sydney over in Australia, Wildcard. What's your optimism, hope, expectation for this game from the Wellington Phoenix perspective, obviously?
Well, the main hope expectation is that I just think this is still a very good team and they have not played to their potential. And I will write a little bit about this probably this afternoon after we record this, published around the same time as this podcast, if all things go to plan. We're just looking at the state of where they are after 6 games, because one thing I've did a few sort of cursory notes to prepare for that, and one thing I noticed is one thing I worked out is because you remember the week 1 they conceded like a 93rd minute equalizer against Adelaide. They've been playing with 10 men for the bulk of the game after Jan Sus got sent off. Scored 1-0, clinging on, doing what you got to do. You start the season with a battling clean sheet and a 1-0 win, playing with 10 men for 2/3 of the game. That's a hell of a way to start, and you give your defense a whole lot of confidence from that. Instead, you concede a late equalizer. Your defense loses a bit of confidence. You got to sort of get that sorted again. And they've just conceded too many goals since then. I looked up Ollie Sale's save percentage, and it's sitting around like high 50s, like 59% or something like that, which is not the worst in the A-League, but his entire career, every season he's played for the Phoenix, some of those he only played 2 or 3 games. Some of those like last 2 seasons, he played 20 plus, always had a save percentage above 70%. So that either tells you that Ollie Sale's playing way worse than normal, or probably more likely is that he's been, there's probably a couple goals, small sample size, where he feels like he could have done better with, and that's part of it. But also I think maybe a bit unlucky, just faced some good finishes, and over the course of more than 6 games, the remaining 20 odd games of the season, that should correct itself. And he's going to have some games where he makes a bunch of saves and they win 2-1 clinging on late or something like that. I think that's something that feels like it will naturally just come right, is they won't concede quite so often because at the fault of their goalkeeper or anything like that. I want to look through how they've conceded all the goals they've conceded, because they've averaged 2 goals against them per game, which is clearly not good enough if you want to make the top sort of 3 or 4 on the table, which I think they're capable of doing. And if they hadn't lost that first game to Adelaide, held on for the 1-0 win, not conceded in the 93rd minute, if they'd held on with like 8 minutes to go or whatever it was, 2-1 up against Western United in the most recent game, which they went on to lose because of a late free kick in stoppage time, in the stoppage time goals killing them, but they also conceded an equalizer with about 5 or 6 minutes to go. Had they held on to win that game, had they held on to win that first game, they would be third on the ladder. Like, they would be third on the table. And they'd have 3 wins from 6 games with a couple of well, those are their only 2 losses, actually. They'd have 3 wins and 3 draws from their first 6 games. That would be an outstanding start. Even if they only drew that second game against who was this thing, Western United, they'd still be 4th, I think. They wouldn't overtake Adelaide, but they'd overtake everyone else. And we'd still be talking about that's a decent start to the season. 2 stoppage time goals, 2 very late stoppage time goals against them changes the narrative so much. It's a bit crazy, which it should, because it changes the results, and the results change where you are on the points table. Like, those are facts. Those aren't sort of like frivolous things. But also, maybe that's not going to happen to them every time they're a goal up late in games. Like, they figure out how to clamp down in the latter stages, and defensively does seem to be their problem because they've scored in every game. They just also haven't kept a clean sheet. They've conceded in every game. So, like, there's natural reasons to think this team will get better. And I still think they're very, very good. I still think this is a top 4 team. And if they are that close as they are to being a top 4 team already, when we know they haven't got near their potential, like a couple minutes of stoppage time shaved off in 2 games, and they would be around that spot. And we're saying this, having said, like, they're not playing as well as we would expect them or hope them to. And I think a lot of that has just been early season, new signings, embedding everyone in, getting on the same sort of wavelength and whatnot. I do think there's a lot of, not only could this team get a lot better, but I think they could get a lot better quite quickly too. I think they could very easily get on a roll coming out of this World Cup break and just win 2 or 3 or 4 on the trot. And I don't think they're a team that has to fear playing away games. You look at the table, who's top of the table? It's Melbourne City. 5 wins from 6 with 1 draw. What was their 1 draw? Wellington Phoenix. There was a Melbourne City home game, and I think Costa Barbarouses scored there. Let me check that. It was a comeback draw as well. Melbourne City 2, Wellington Phoenix 2-0. They were 2-0 up after 34 minutes. Sam Sutton scored in the 79th minute, and Costa Barbarouses scored in the 90th minute. So I guess the late goals giveth and the late goals taketh. So, but they're the only team to take a point off of the top team on the ladder. That should be decent enough evidence that this team is capable not only of like competing with anyone, but competing with anyone whether they're home or away as well. So I genuinely think they could just go like win 3 or 4 games on the trot coming out of this break and be in a great position. They might not, but also it's a long season, so you got plenty of time to make up for the way things have started. I talked about being cautiously optimistic about the Breakers at the start going into that season. This is not cautious. I'm just straight up optimistic. I think the Phoenix are really good, and I think they've got if it's now over the next month, or if it's in a month's time later on in the season, I genuinely think they've got like a 3, 4, 5 game winning streak in them. And the A-League men's isn't too much different to the A-League women's, where there's where are we? Melbourne City's the only undefeated team. Western Sydney Wanderers are the only other team who have won more than half their games. You go on a win streak, you move up that table very quickly. That's all it takes, really. And the Phoenix have that in them. I'm sure of it.
There is this thread of the Breakers looming in the background of our discussion, and the Warriors as well. You mentioned, well, the last variety show I asked you about the Breakers' biggest weakness. And
yes,
it feels like the biggest weakness for the Phoenix are the two centre backs. This is based off a lot of research on my end, Wildcard. Like, I don't say this lightly. I've done a lot of hard mahi to come to this conclusion, which is in contrast to the Breakers. The Breakers don't have a defensive weakness. Their identity is defense. Yes, they do a lot of other shit well, but as we've discussed plenty, they are in a good position because of their defensive focus. It does seem like the Phoenix, whether it's feedback from the fans, whether it's the eye test watching the games, like they do kind of, the centre back pairing does seem somewhat fragile, whether it's a lapse in concentration, whether it's an overly frisky pass there, you bite off more than you can chew and it gets turned over, then suddenly there's a counter attack on. But like in front of them, you've got Clayton Lewis and Ugarkovic. They're pretty good. On the left, you got Sam Sutton bursting up and down the left flank. On the right, usually Callan Gould or Tim
Elliott, or Tim Payne. Yeah,
Callan Gould's the Englishman, right?
A bit. Callan Gould's the English fella for Wellington Olympic. He's a good player, a good left foot. That guy.
Callan Elliott is the Phoenix right back.
That's the one.
Okay. And he and Tim Payne kind of share that duty, but Tim Payne can also play centre back, but doesn't usually start at centre back. The two centre backs are
Scott Wooden and Josh Laws, which is an interesting to watch. Because what you're saying is right. Like it's not specifically the centre backs; it's the defense as a whole. But the centre backs set the tone. So they've been conceding a few too many goals, particularly conceding a few too many goals from set pieces. Maybe converted midfielder Josh Laws, as much as you like having the left-footed passing option and your build-up play in centre back, it's quite important. It's very helpful. Maybe the better option is Tim Payne and Scott Wooden, because they're your two best headers of a ball. They're your two most physical defenders, two best at the actual defensive arts, and you just have to cop the fact that your build-up play might not be quite as flash as a result. I'm curious to see how that looks, because I think there was one game where they both started, but I'd have to check that. But definitely it's mostly been Wooden and Laws, and I wonder if that might change.
Yeah, part of it is just the lack of a talisman. Like, there's no centre back who's like the stalwart of the team. Like, both these centre backs feel like they're trying to work their way into consistent A-League footy, as opposed to like, this dude is a legend of the club. His mana is undeniable. And you can put anyone you want with him because of that experience and that composure.
Yeah, Stephen Taylor, basically.
Durante, there's a long history of those blokes in New Zealand football and for the Wellington Phoenix. Neither of those centre-backs give me that vibe, and I think that is probably the concerning weakness to counter your pure optimism about a streak of wins. I would add some caution to that optimism based on my centre back musings.
Well, the results back up that caution so far. But I mean, Wooden should be that guy. He's an import player. He's played at a pretty high level, and he's a good player. And he's shown more than flashes last season to show that he's capable of being that guy. I think he probably was that guy for stretches last season. I'm sure he'd probably be the first to admit, although he's not going to get that opportunity because I'm going to say it before him, and I don't think I'm the first either, but to admit that his first 6 games probably weren't his best. And maybe that's a bit of a combination thing with Laws as well, because Laws missed a lot of last season with injury. I wonder if there's some of that involved. But yeah, I think for them to be a team that reaches their potential, he is going to need to play better. And I think he will. So I will say that I'm relatively confident, at least. But yeah, if he doesn't perform at an import level, like an import caliber level of performance, they're not going to, because it's not going to happen otherwise. Like he has to play a bit better for the team to become a better defensive team, which was what they need to do in order to start turning draws into wins and losses into draws, potentially into wins as well.
Pick up yourself for listening to another episode of The Niche Cast. Thank you for your presence. And we will drop a email newsletter tomorrow. As we've discussed, a lot of niche case content on the website coming up as well. And of course, podcasts early next week. So stay tuned and keep an eye out. If you are a member of the Patreon whānau, keep an eye out for the post on the Patreon page early next week to drive our Patreon podcast and what we discuss. Kia kaha, stay beautiful. Church.